In this video, we're gonna rank the 19 hardest of the 50 state high points in the United States. Subscribe to the Slow Boat Sailing channel. We give you the secrets of how to crush your outdoor adventure. This is part of my work as a professor. I wrote this paper because I got interested in the state high points. I've summited 9. I've done a lot of elevation hikes. The highest peak I've done was not in the U.S., but it was this Pico de Orizaba in Mexico, which is about 18,500 feet. It's the 3rd highest peak in North America, highest peak in Mexico, highest volcano in North America. It's only behind Mount Logan in Canada and Mount Denali in terms of its height. But so I've hiked and climbed a lot of mountains, typically non-technical, except I might have done some glacier travel. But I wanted to think about, what the factors I thought were important in terms of making a high point hard or easy. And if you've seen my channel here, we've got videos of several of those hikes of the high points, and some are just really easy, they're drive ups, and some are really hard like Denali. And I wanted to kind of use my background as a numbers guy to try to give you the ranking. So it's a 6-factor ranking that I have. There's the class, so that's the Yosemite class. So 1 is like you are, it's an established trail, you don't have to use your hands. 2, you may have to use your hands, and you might have to do some route finding, but there may be a trail most of the way. So Yosemite class is always for the crux of the route. It's the hardest point in the route. Class 3 is that you may have to use your hands, and you may have a risk of falling with that, but probably the falls will not be fatal and most people won't use protection for class 3. Class 4, most people will choose to use protection. Falls are likely to be fatal, and so that's the highest class of any of the 50 state high points. So if you use the easiest route, not the hardest route, but the easiest route, there's none of them that's over class 4. So Denali is class 4, I think, if you use a West Buttress route. But Whitney, if you use Whitney Trail, that's class 1 because it's an established trail. You really don't need to do any scrambling on Whitney Trail, so there's not even the use of the third hand typically. So most of them are going to be essentially class 1, but there's going to be a certain percentage that have no walking at all, and those are class 0. So we're not going to look at any of those class 0s. We'll see some class 1s. The other one is elevation. Elevation makes the air thinner. It makes it colder, so thinner air is harder. Colder means that you have to carry more gear typically. Elevation in feet, elevation gain, so that's usually what you're looking at, like how much elevation gain do I need to do. The rule of thumb is like 1 hour for every 1,000 feet, but I'm sure there's lots of people who could do that in half the time or a third the time. If you're like a tough trail runner. Road trip distance in miles, round trip distance in miles, so you're going to see elevation gain and mileage on all trails if you do that, and that's going to be usually posted at most of the trailheads. So you gotta one factor is elevation gain that's going to slow you down, and the other factor is total distance. Then latitude in degrees. So Denali is like 63 degrees north latitude, and I think Mauna Kea in Hawaii is like 18 degrees north latitude. Most of the peaks are going to be between 30 and 45 north latitude in the lower 48. And then the glacier dummy. If there's a glacier, that probably means you're going to pass over the glacier route, but not necessarily. If you do, you may want to rope up. You may need crampons, ice axe, and glacier rescue techniques. At least somebody in your party is going to need to know that. So that's definitely true for Denali, and there are about 5 peaks that have glaciers. Mount Hood, I think typically people don't rope up. Denali and Mount Rainier, people typically do. And then Bora and Granite, or Gannett, I'm not sure which one. Let's see, has the glacier. Bora, Hood, Gannett has the glacier. I'm not sure how much they walk on the glacier on Gannett, but you know, it just is another thing indicating that, and that's kind of a dummy variable. Okay, so dummy variable either is or isn't. It's equal to 1 or 0. So we're going to give you the list and not go through all the tables in my paper. But you can read the full thing in my paper. A link is going to be in the description. Just click on the download button, and we'll look at this is my paper here. So just hit the download button, and you'll get it'll download a copy for you. All right, so when I combine all these indexes and then I scale it so that Denali is 100, there's like 2 that really stand out. So Denali and Gannett. And the big thing is that Gannett is class 4, and it's got glaciers, and it's got a longer distance to the summit than Denali. Now, I think Vanderheide, which is cited in my paper, who's got a Summit Post article, he adds up Denali's, like, that you have how many carries you do on Denali. So if you go to a higher altitude mountain, the way you acclimatize typically, because there's no other place to acclimatize except on the big mountain, because there's nothing really bigger, or there's nothing easier to acclimatize on, is to, you know, carry loads from one camp to the other and then drop it off. I mean, you could pay a porter, but you still need to take the trip because you want to go high, sleep low, and then slowly increase your sleeping altitude. And so on Denali, that's one of the things that you're going to do. You're going to carry some loads from base camp and then go back down to base camp. And so he doesn't count the shortest distance, he counts the load distance, but I don't. So really, Denali's the only one that you need to do that for. You know, I guess my take is that it doesn't matter how much you put Denali on top, it's still going to be on top. So so Gannett Peak in Wyoming is the only very hard beside Denali. And then we've got these other peaks, Rainier in Washington, which is a 14er, which is hard. It's the most glaciated peak in the United States. Success rate is about 50%. I have been on Rainier. We were not successful because I couldn't convince the guides to go a day earlier, and so they waited for the storm to come. Because they're selling trips, they don't care. They don't care if you summit, and they actually, you know, there's actually a perverse incentive not to summit. Because Rainier is so sold out that they don't care, really. I mean, you can't get a permit without the lottery at Rainier, and you can't get the guides sell out all their slots like months in advance, so they don't need to convince anybody to go with their services, and they act like it. And then Granite Peak, Montana is hard. It's got a long approach. Let's see, granite is also class 4, so you probably want to put down ropes on the easiest route on the crux, and it's not super high, about under 13,000 feet. Kings Peak is, I think, class 2. Yeah, so there's some route finding for Kings Peak and some scrambling, but it's not as bad as the others, but it's really long, so you do need to camp it. So Whitney, I ended up camping several days because I couldn't get a Whitney lottery at the time I wanted to go, so I just used a through hiking permit. So that's kind of similar to what Kings Peak would be like, but if you win the lottery, then it's as little as 21 miles, and that's the only class 1 that we have. So the Whitney Trail is so popular. There's this lottery. It's a pretty low chance that you're going to win the lottery, and then we've got this Bora Peak, Idaho. I think is class 3, and it has a glacier. I'm not sure you have to go on the glacier though. Its distance is relatively short, so it's a little tricky. I think they have something called the Chicken Out Ridge. That's one of the hard peaks. And then finally Mount Hood. Mount Hood is probably the most summited of all these mountains. It's insane the number of people summiting Mount Hood. You do not need a permit. You do not have to go in a party of 2. Even though there is a glacier, I'm not sure on the standard route by the lifts near Timberline Lodge. I don't think you have a ton of glacier risk of falling in unless you slip into the Bergstrom or something like that. So it's not like, I don't think that the glacier kind of opens up into crevasses. I think that was kind of similar to what Pico Orizaba. It really doesn't open up crevasses. I'm not sure how thick the glacier is in Pico, but at Hood there is a huge Bergstrom, which is a permanent crevasse which you need to avoid, and there are fumaroles which you need to avoid, but those are like standard landmarks that you can obviously avoid. It's just you need to have crampons, ice axe. If you're going the most direct route, the Pearly Gates, then you need to do some ice climbing, but the easiest route is the Old Chute, and both are really considered the standard route, but the Old Chute, you could get away with 1 ice axe. Is recommended you bring 2, maybe 1 long one and 1 tool. So, and it's also, Hood is 11,000 feet, so the shortest of the hard peaks. And then and then the moderate peaks, so we might as well start the moderate peaks, start with Mount Elbert. So anything between 80 and 40 is hard. Anything between 80 and 100 is very hard, right? And then, a lot of the hard peaks, you might have to camp for a few days. Like Whitney, you should probably choose the camping option unless you're a trail runner, an experienced trail runner. You do the Leadville 50 or 100 and don't worry about it. The other ones are maybe short, but they have things that make them more technically difficult. Rainier, you're going to need to camp at least 1 night. So I think Rainier, you have to go to Camp Muir, and then you go the Disappointment Cleaver to the top. Route finding's not a big issue because it's so popular, and that route is tended because of the guiding services that get monopolies or oligopoly there. But the weather is quite bad on Rainier, and it's quite common that you're going to get bad weather, and that's why the summit percent is so low. Especially since you can't choose the day you try, you just get your permit and you get a crappy day, or you don't get a crappy day. It's just the luck of the draw, because you don't get to get the permit. Like, you don't get to get your booking or your permit within the time that you could get a weather forecast. You have to get it months before. And then, actually a lot of people fail on Whitney, especially the 24-hour permits. I think that it's less than 50%, even though thousands of people summit it every year, I'm sure. And that's for the summertime, right? And then Bora Peak, not many people are going up it. And so now we're at the moderate peak. So let's roll down and look at the moderate peaks. So the moderate peaks, I would say it's kind of a layup if you have the physical chops to do it. So that if you can run every day of the week and do a 5K without problems, and you take enough water, and you take enough food, and you give yourself enough time, and you're willing to put the time in, and you go on a day where it's not going to storm, then you should be able to do all of these. So 9 is Elbert, number 10 is Boundary Peak, Nevada, number 11 is Mount Marcy. So Mount Marcy is just one of the longer ones. It doesn't have a lot of elevation, but it is a very long walk. Mount Katahdin, you got more of a walk than a lot of these, but not a ton of elevation, but it can be quite cold. That's also the end of the Appalachian Trail and is thus very popular. Humphreys Peak, Arizona, 13. Wheeler Peak, New Mexico. I recently did Wheeler Peak in Elbert, and then also recently did Guadalupe. All very nice hikes. Guadalupe is easier than Wheeler, and Wheeler's easier than Elbert, I would say. But this was like a numerical ranking, so I didn't put my subjective opinions in that. So I didn't say, oh, I think Wheeler's a little tougher. Mount Rogers in Virginia, and then Black Elk Peak in South Dakota, and then Black Mesa. So I've done Black Elk, which is also called Mount Harney. Those aren't very hard. I think one of the other things is I haven't mentioned this, and so maybe I'll mention this just for the hard peaks. What makes them hard? The elevation gain is on this ranking, also makes them hard. So you're talking about for Gannett 8,650, Mount Rainier 91,000 elevation gain, Granite 7,700, right? Whitney 6,700. So those are, you're really stretching it to do that in one. You get over 5,000 feet elevation gain, you're really stretching to do that in one day. Bora is 5,500, Mount Hood 5,300. Mount Elbert, the data I was using said 5,000, although I think it's 4,500. But I use the date. When I use a data set, I just use the whole thing. I don't pick and choose the data. And then Boundary Peak, and then you're looking at Boundary Peak, Mount Marcy, Mount Katahdin. Those are now in the 3,000 to 4,000 range. Wheeler 3,000, Guadalupe about 3,000. Then you get down to Mount Rogers, Black Elk, Black Mesa, and you're 1,500 to as little as 800. So that's really kind of another big distinction. Not only are these class 1 hikes on the Yosemite scale, but they're also like they have less elevation gain, and they typically also have less mileage, right? But it's that elevation gain usually is a big determinant of whether it's, easy or not. And these peaks also, all the moderate peaks don't have glaciers. They're all class 1, I believe. So yeah, they're all class 1. So, but there's still a physical challenge, right? And they potentially could take all day or 10 hours. So kind of 8 hours, put in a day's work. It's a good bit of exercise, but not technically difficult, and not as physically demanding as some of these other summits that may take multi-day camping trips. Alright, subscribe to the Slow Boat Sailing channel. We give you the secrets to crush your outdoor adventure. Stay tuned for our easiest 31 summits on the U.S. High Point list. And if you are interested in the paper, link is in the description, and a full reading of the paper will be and a more technical analysis of the paper will be on Finance Professor podcast at financeprofessor.org or linuswilson.com. We'll have links also to these things. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.